Welcome to Austin Tech Connect, the official podcast of the Austin Technology Council. Presented to you by Netspend. Homegrown in Austin, Netspend has been a leading provider of consumer and business payment solutions for almost 25 years. From prepaid cards to mobile bank accounts to money movement services, Netspend connects people, brands, and payment products to deliver innovative financial solutions.
Welcome to Austin Tech Connect, the podcast about the future of Austin's technology community. My name is Tom Singer, and I'm the CEO at the Austin Technology Council. And every single week, we engage local leaders right here on this podcast to hear their story of success, to learn about their organization, and to find out how we can all thrive moving into the future. And today, I am really excited because we are joined by Hugh Forrest from South by Southwest. Hey, Hugh, welcome to Austin Tech Connect.
Hey, Tom. Good morning. It is fantastic to be here. I always love all the energy you bring to everything you do. So great to see it on the podcast today.
Great to have you here. So for those of you who don't know Hugh Forrest, and if you live in Austin, I don't know how you don't know Hugh Forrest. He's one of the most recognizable features. He stands about 9 feet tall, so you can't miss him. Can't miss him standing in a crowd, but also from almost the beginning of South by Southwest, he has been there and he has helped grow that South by Southwest interactive side that has now become such a big part of South by Southwest, that whole tech conference thing. He's had his hands in that the whole time. He is now the co-president and chief programming officer for South by Southwest. And what he does is he oversees all of the content that occurs during that March magic that happens right here in Austin that we call South by Southwest. So Hugh, let's go back in a time machine to 1989. How did you end up joining South by Southwest?
Great question, Tom. My origin story is as follows, and we know that origin stories are sometimes fact and sometimes a little bit fiction or embellishment. I grew up in Austin, went away for 4 years to the Midwest for college, came back. This was 1984 when I came back. Print was still a thing. I had started an alternative publication called the Austin Challenger. I always say it was alternative because of its publishing schedule, not necessarily because of its politics. I was bleeding through lots and lots of money. My dad finally said to me, you could save a lot if you bought if we bought a Mac and a desktop printer. You could do all your typesetting that way. And, I resisted for a while because I, of course, was 20 years old and knew a lot more than my dad did.
You got to love the fact that you're a 20-something and your dad was like, I think you should get a Macintosh in the 1980s.
Well, or love the fact that I pretended I knew more than my dad. Anyway, so we got this Mac Plus. We got this laser writer. It allowed the endeavor to survive a few more years. But that I got hired at South by Southwest because I had a computer, and at that point, they did not. I can still remember the phone call I got from Roland, who has been my boss for 30 years, asking, well, can we move our database onto a computer? And I said, well, that's, computers are really good for databases. You ought to be able to do that. And then there was a pause of about 10 seconds, and Roland said, well, how about your computer? So again, I got hired because I had a computer, and previous to that, they were hosting their whole database up as I was hosting this whole database on an old typesetting machine. Importance of having the right hardware at the right time. That computer, again, was a Mac Plus, which is about, 1/1000th of our smartphone at present. Things change, and it was state of the art at the time. And
what I love about this story is when we think of South by Southwest, we think of this giant international organization that has touched the lives of millions and millions of people. And yet, if we just go back to 1989, they didn't have a computer. I mean, this is inspiration for every entrepreneurial venture in every industry who is like, I don't have 2 nickels to rub together. What can I do? It's like, hey, you hire the right person, they've got the hardware, and, just a few years later, you become something magical.
Yeah, well, it was I certainly never had any imagination, any inkling, any whatever back in the late 80s, early 90s that this thing would be lucky enough to grow as much as it has. We certainly caught a lot of lucky breaks along the way, as do most successful ventures or endeavors. The fact that I had a computer back in 1987 when we decided to launch what was then called multimedia, which was going to be the tech portion of the event, Roland said, well, why don't you kind of manage this, because you had this computer, and if you've ever seen me on a computer, I can barely turn the thing on. So that was that was generous of my tech abilities. But again, it all flowed back to this Mac Plus.
So the origins of South by Southwest were a music conference. And now many people don't realize that. They think it's this tech conference that has this music and film and other side. So when you started multimedia, it was the smaller section. And I met you in the late 90s or early 2000s, and it was much smaller at that point than the music conference. When did sort of what we became known as interactive, when did that really start to become the big push for South by Southwest?
Yeah, that's another great question, Tom. I mean, we, again, launched this thing called multimedia in 1994, or bolted this on to what was music. At that point, state of the art for most people in terms of technology was CD-ROM. So we were very focused on CD-ROM technology and how this was changing the world, and it was at the time. We were also somewhat ironically, very focused on education. That was in large part due to the influence of Dewey Winburn. We changed the name from multimedia to interactive around 2000. That certainly reflected that, people were discovering this thing called the internet, that it was, all of a sudden more open to more people. And then, we were lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time, in the early years of the social media revolution, and trace this back to maybe 2004. We had a guy named Jonathan Abrams, who was the founder and CEO of a thing called Friendster, was one of our keynotes. Then, the kind of turning point was a couple of years later when Twitter kind of launched at South by Southwest. But again, that was really being in the right place, right time on social media, having a lot of those early pioneers at South by Southwest. That was really what propelled the tech portion of the event to become much more front and center. And really for those first 5 or 6 years when we were multimedia, it was, if the event was a standalone event, we probably wouldn't have made it. We had this big thing called South by Southwest Music that was kind of paying the bills and providing support. And, I kept arguing to my boss, Roland, that I just don't think this makes sense, having technology within this large music event. And Roland would always say, well, let's give it a little bit longer and maybe it'll catch on. And lo and behold, he was right. His thought always was that technology was going to catch up to the masses, and people who didn't understand what technology was, what connectedness was, what interactivity was, what a connected society was in the mid to late 90s, that as this thing called the internet bloomed, it would people would catch on and it would change everything. And he was very correct in that understanding.
So in the early 2000s, like I said, is about the time that I sort of crossed paths with you. And I love to tell the story, and you cringe. I won't say numbers, but you didn't have a sponsor for your keynote, and you really needed to make sure you could cover his airfare, his hotel, and food and everything while he was in Austin. And one of the partners at the law firm where I was the director of marketing was a huge music fan, and he was very into South by Southwest and had been for a decade. And he walked into my office and said, I need some of the marketing budget. And I didn't have a big marketing budget. And it was, we'll call it a few $1,000s that he was able to talk me out of. And the law firm I worked for became the sponsor of the keynote. I mean, you would never get away with such a small price now. But what I remember is we got a bunch of free passes with it. And I was like, I'll go to this, whatever. And I didn't even really know what I was walking into. And I remember, let's call this about 2004. And I walked in and it was the most incredible experience because of that connectivity piece, that interactive human to human piece that was going on. I can remember walking down the halls and seeing some of these early stage, interactive internet celebrities, and you'd say hi to them and they'd stop and talk to you and they'd say, hey, well, I'm going to go get lunch. I can remember, one of those early years, maybe about 2007, Chris Brogan and I crossed paths and he was like, I'm going to lunch. Do you want to come with me? And Chris and I went and had lunch. And it was that everybody was an equal at South by Southwest. There wasn't sort of, well, that's a CEO or we're having this private party in a suite and only curated people can come to it. There was really a sense of community. Was that on purpose or was that by accident?
I would love to say that was absolutely intentional, Tom, but I think it was more just maybe by accident is a little bit too strong, but we were a smaller event there then. You could contain it all in one building, so it wasn't as it was easier for everyone to interact, and that facilitated a lot of those connections. So, who was the keynote in 2004? Do you remember?
Again, you might correct my year on that, but I think it was Richard Florida.
Yeah. No, that's what I was going to say. So, I mean, the irony of that story. And I don't think I'm, belying too much trust to say this, is that Richard Florida had just written The Rise of the Creative Class. And if you've ever read that book or skimmed that book or read about that book, like Austin was the
star
poster child for this whole thing about how Austin was going to be the big city of the future. And, 20 years later, lo and behold, Richard Florida was absolutely right.
He nailed it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So we needed some money to cover his travel costs. And I remember going to the Austin Chamber and saying, like, do you guys have any budget? I mean, and this guy's, all he writes about is Austin. This is great publicity for Austin. And the Chamber they're nice folks, but they said, I just don't think this fits. And again, I mean, just the irony that 20 years later, everything he said, or almost everything he said about Austin came true, and Austin has grown into this powerhouse, booming city, economically vibrant place for so many people to live, and again, in large part because the focus on creativity, particularly in the early 2000s when Richard Florida wrote this stuff. So yeah, that's a great story and connects a lot of different points along the history of the event.
So that's actually a good transition, right? You look back at sort of the rise of the creative class, Richard's book, and the things he talked about and what Austin was going to become, because we did have that spark. We had the artists, we had the musicians, we had the technology, and sort of that perfect storm coming together. And he predicted that was going to be the future. And we're living that today. How much has South by Southwest played in helping put Austin on the map as that tech leader? I know some people give you a lot of credit. Some people try to take some credit away. Where do you think the actual piece of South by Southwest's role in Austin, where do you think it really fits?
Well, I think that we deserve credit to the extent that South by Southwest shines a very bright spotlight on the creativity that occurs in Austin 52 weeks a year. But we bring in a lot of media from all over the U.S., all over the world. We bring in influencers, people who are writing, pushing out lots of social media. So it is accelerated Austin's positioning as this hub of creativity. Now, I do think that, in 2023, where we are now, this has turned from one of our greatest assets to one of our greatest challenges in terms of how do we retain this creativity, this focus on creativity in a city that, because of growth, is the cost of living here is so much more than it was before. That was always one of the huge competitive advantages of Austin, is that you had this artistic, this creative, this innovative community because it was so cheap to live here. And I am certainly a proponent that growth is good and that all changes are essentially good changes. But I do think that the rising cost of living here threatens a lot of the traditional advantages that we've had and that we've leveraged so well for our growth.
Well, you bring up a great point. I just got back a couple of weeks ago from a meeting of a group called TECNA, which is the Technology Councils of North America. And a lot of people look at the Austin Technology Council and they don't realize that we're one of 60 plus technology councils that exist in the United States. And we're tiny compared to some of these other places. Some of them have, 20 plus people on their staffs and they're doing, things. And we were ahead of the game when it came to positioning as a city, positioning ourselves as a destination for companies to move, as a destination for young tech workers to move. And we were sort of the only alternative that was out there waving that flag 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago to what was going on in the Silicon Valley and some other big cities. And we had a lot of things going for us. We have the warm weather most of the year, a little too hot in August and September, if you will. But we have, a good climate. We have center of the country. We had a lot of things going for it. And then the affordability piece was the piece that sort of put the icing on the cake that really made everything happen. And that ship has sailed. I talked to a CEO. I talked to a lot of CEOs in this role. And he said for the first time since he's had his company, he couldn't relocate somebody he wanted to hire out of San Diego because she couldn't find an apartment that was cheaper. Now, it wasn't more expensive, but she didn't see making a 15,000 mile, 1,500 mile move for a lateral financial move. And, she was seeing that the prices for living in an equivalent place to where she was in San Diego, her lifestyle wasn't going to change. And he said that was the first time he couldn't lure somebody out of a city that was, traditionally more expensive into Austin. And so that ship has sailed. So what do you think happens? How does Austin now step forward without the affordability piece? I mean, we're still more affordable than, San Jose, California, but we're getting closer. What do we need to do looking to the future to make sure that we're still competitive? Because these other cities, I'll tell you, I met with a bunch of them a few weeks ago. They're getting very aggressive. And sometimes people go, oh, no one would ever move to that town. Yeah, a lot of them have a lot of attractive things that they're putting together and they're new and they're exciting. So we have to be prepared as a town to compete in this new world where there's other alternatives to Austin. So what do you think we need to do to move forward?
If I had that magic bullet, Tom, I would be in a position much more powerful than I mean, I think that just adding a little more context or to what you said, I think that these other cities, yeah, they saw what Austin did. They read Richard Florida's book. They heard his lectures, and they've tried to position themselves accordingly, and often with much success. I think that we have to, the city of Austin has to continue to have these incredibly difficult conversations and thought processes about how to create a city that is affordable for musicians as it is for tech workers. I mean, the other part of this equation is that tech salaries are so much higher than the salaries that musicians, artists, playwrights, writers, novelists, photographers, whatever you want to say, can make. That it is really, has really made it difficult for what was so much of the bread and butter of the city for so long to live here. I think that, this was something that Mayor Adler focused on, but it's a difficult question. I don't know that he ever completely cracked the nut on this equation. I think it's something that Mayor Watson is focused on also. I think it's something that we're all, to an extent focused on. We know this is a challenge. It plays into, well, if we can't create affordable regions of the city, then maybe the mass transit thing is the key, where people can live slightly outside of the city at slightly more affordable rates. But again, it's a huge challenge moving forward. And I will say that, you may have heard me say this before, these challenges that Austin faces in terms of cost of living, affordability, very much mirror the challenges we have at South by Southwest, where, when you first came to South by Southwest in 2004, it was really affordable to go to. And I remember talking to an executive once in like 2008, and him looking down, we were going up an escalator, and it's like, this is great. There's so many young people here that I can learn from. And this is so different than every other event I go to. Well, 15 years later, it is not so cheap to attend South by Southwest. It's turned more into an event that's focused on executives. We still have lots of students and young people, but not proportionally, it's not as much as it was before. So this is one of our big challenges moving forward too, is how do we bring this next generation into the event within the pricing structure that we've essentially moved to over the last few years. Again, these are all great questions, which I can outline till the cows come home. I don't quite have the answers yet.
Well, and it is true that back then we did not have nearly enough hotel rooms for everything that was going on. And now we certainly have a huge inventory of hotels. However, Austin's very proud of its rates. I talk to meeting planners. My background as a professional speaker. I have a lot of friends around the country who put on major events. And I'm like, come to Austin. I'm always the biggest cheerleader you'll ever meet for bringing an event to Austin. I always talk about, that shadow of South by Southwest. You can have that cool vibe and all this stuff. And they call back and they go, wow, it's more expensive per night in Austin than some of these other large cities for hotel rooms and for them to rent ballrooms and to be able to get buses to do things. We're not the affordable city. So that means that I think that as an entire community, from tech to everywhere else, we have to find ways to collaborate, to find more things that we can put in that positive bucket. And that leads me to something that I talk to a lot of people about, and that is everybody playing well together in the pool. There's a lot of organizations, for-profit and nonprofits, that exist that help with the economic development and the vibe and the business class of Austin. And just recently, about 3 weeks ago, you and I both were on the stage at the Chamber of Commerce A-List Awards. You received a special award. I presented one of the awards. Austin Technology Council was one of the community partners with the Chamber of Commerce. South by Southwest was one of the major sponsors. Why is it important that we all play together very well in different events and support each other?
Well, I'm a huge proponent in the general and the specific concept of community, and certainly the secret or not so secret sauce as to why South by Southwest is successful is that we have this incredible community in Austin that supports the event. We have this incredible virtual community from around the U.S. and across the world that also supports the event. So community is extremely important to me, and I think that's that is why we get involved with events like Austin A-List, where we work together, where we network, where we try to find out ways to help each other. I think we are fairly all committed to this idea that a rising tide lifts all boats, and that the more opportunities we have for technology, for startups, for investors in Austin, the better that is for everyone. So again, events like A-List are fantastic ways for us to connect with people, for us to show them that South by Southwest is, for as big as it is in some ways, it's ultimately just a people that are very much like everyone else that are running the thing and get to know us, and that's the best way to understand the event more. So again, this all flows into this big idea of community.
So coming up in just a couple of weeks, your panel picker for 2024 will open up. So how can the Austin tech community get more involved? I mean, we think sometimes that, South by Southwest, the Austin technology community is deeply involved, super involved with South by Southwest. But sometimes, when you start peeling back, there's a lot of companies who don't participate. They don't apply to have somebody speak. They don't send people to South by Southwest. What are some things that everyone in the tech ecosystem in Austin can do to help support South by Southwest and therefore help support the overall vibe of Austin?
Well, as you mentioned, we start the panel picker entry process on Tuesday, June 27th. That goes for about a month. That's when anyone in the community can enter a speaking proposal for the 2024 event. This has been a system that we've used for roughly 15 years. It's a great way to get people involved with South by Southwest, to engage them, to create momentum for the event in the summer, which was a time where we typically didn't have a lot of momentum, to understand what is important to this community right now and what is not important to this community. So this is a great way for folks to get involved with the event. And then to your question or your thought process of how can more companies get involved with the event? I mean, there's so many ways to be involved with the event, from speaking, from being involved with the trade show, Creative Industries Expo, to doing some kind of reception. But there's also just, taking part in any number of activities that are either formal or informal that happen during the event. I mean, I'm a firm believer that you get the most out of the event by having a badge, but I'm also a firm believer that you get that you get a lot out of the event by just showing up and following the Tom Singer playbook of not being an introvert and trying to meet as many people as possible and seeing what kind of amazing opportunities can rise out of those connections. I will also say that, I'm speaking your language more than you're speaking mine, is that the small connections you make at an event like South by Southwest or at an event like A-List, at any of the networking events around town that happen 52 weeks a year, they may not be immediately productive, but long-term they can lead to really, really big things. So I'm a huge proponent of that also, of, try to make as many connections as possible, follow up with an email, and you never know what happens. That person you met at blank event on Tuesday night, a year later calls back with a huge opportunity.
Yeah, well, I would love to see the Austin Technology Council find a way to get more involved next year. I don't know what that looks like, but there's got to be a way to help let our fingers, touch that and pull like some sort of a vibe about how does the Austin tech community be part of South by Southwest and not get drowned sometimes in the the large, tens of thousands of people who are coming from around the world. There's got to be some ways to have sort of that local hub, and I'd love to see our community find a way to be part of that.
Well, absolutely. And don't forget that, or we can't forget that the Austin tech community, the Austin music community, the Austin film community is one of the biggest reasons South by Southwest has grown. People from around the U.S., around the world want to come in, want to connect with these people, want to, learn the secret sauce of your creativity. So it is impossible to separate South by Southwest from Austin. That line is ever porous, ever vague. People love coming to South by Southwest, but even more, they love coming to Austin at a time of year when it's spring, when the flowers are blooming, when there's this whole symbolic as well as actual rebirth and inspiration and wave of new ideas. These are reasons that we've been lucky enough to have success. But again, foremost of those reasons is how strong this community is in Austin in so many different ways.
So Hugh, before I let you go, there's a couple questions I always ask everyone who comes on the show. The first one is, I say, these are my words, community, collaboration, and conversation can solve all problems. Which of those three words resonates with you the most, and why?
Well, I'll say that you're a man after my own heart with the alliteration. I try to alliterate everything because it's easier to remember that way. Hence the panel picker terminology. I've told you that community is probably the most important thing to me, but I don't see that those three words are all that different. I mean, community is conversation. Community is collaboration. The more you can facilitate these kinds of connections, which ding ding is another C word there, the stronger you can be. And that goes for an event like South by Southwest, this giant event, or for, a 10-person meetup, both of which have extreme value. It's again, finding ways to connect with other people. That seems state of the art, but it's also basic. It's what we've been doing since the beginning of mankind is learning how to connect better with other people, learning what skills you can bring to the table, what skills you can find from someone else to work together to build something even greater. But again, my word there, or I'll go with community, but I think you can't lose with conversation or collaboration either.
Nice. And the final thing that I just started asking for the last month or so is, if you had someone come to visit you for the first time in Austin, one of your family members or an old college friend, they'd never been to Austin, where's the one place that you would never miss taking them in town?
I think for us, simply because we live in, or mainly because we live in Northwest, we usually take people to Mount Bunnell. It's a great view of the lake, of downtown Austin. For people who think Texas is one big flat place, it certainly dispels that stereotype. Just don't leave any valuables in your car, right?
I was thinking I was going to make a joke about the fact that I don't go there anymore because I'm scared someone's going to smash my window. But I thought maybe I shouldn't make that joke. But that is become a problem. Is that they break into a lot of cars there. But go back when I moved here in 1991, I was being recruited for a job, and I flew in, and the owner of the company that brought me here took me to Mount Bunnell. We walked up the stairs and we stood there on the big cement. I always remember this so vividly. We stood on the cement picnic table that's up there, and we overlooked the skyline, which was 1/10 of what the skyline is today. And we talked about what was the future that this town could be. And I've always looked back and thought, wow, so much has changed since the day I stood on top of that table. But so much has changed for me as well. And it's been a great 31 years living here in Austin, having seen the tech community grow up and the whole community grow up. My wife and I always say, because we were 25 and 23 when we moved here, we always say that we grew up with the Austin business community. And this has been a great place to be for the last 31 years. So Hugh Forrest, any last words for the Austin Technology Council listeners here of Austin Tech Connect?
Just a reminder on that June 27th, opening of the panel picker. Also, you can always reach me, Hugh, at SXSW.com if you have great ideas for South by Southwest, constructive criticism of what we've done in the past, just any kind of communication. Again, I'm a firm believer in this. I'm pretty good at answering and responding to emails. Love to hear more people. And Tom, thank you for all you've done. Glad that you're in this new role at the Austin Technology Council. But again, you've been teaching tech people how to connect for 20, 30 years. And that is a huge, huge service, and applaud all your efforts there.
Well, thank you. And it's been fun. I've had the privilege of speaking at South by Southwest, not for many years, but probably about 8 times. And it always ranks as some of my favorite things I've ever done as a speaker from that side of my life. So thank you for giving me those opportunities since I wrote my first book in 2005.
Awesome. It's been great to have you involved.
Well, thank you. And thank you for being on Austin Tech Connect and for everything you do for the Austin community. And thanks to everybody who listens to this podcast. Hey, is your company a member of the Austin Technology Council? We would welcome your involvement. We want to have you add your voice to our tech community as we look to the future. Please join the Austin Technology Council today.
Thanks for listening to the Austin Tech Connect podcast. Make sure your company is a member of the Austin Technology Council and add your voice to the future of our tech ecosystem in Central Texas.